welcome to History in Lowell. I'm Maritza Grooms. I'm here with my buddy Bob Forrant, and we have a special guest today, Allison Horrocks of the Lowell National Historical Parks.
That's right.
Such a long title.
It is.
So thank you for being on the show today, Allison.
Thank you.
I'm really excited because we've been talking a lot about Lowell's history for 2 years now, and just so many things that go into what makes Lowell what it is today, right? And the parks are really influential in how we tell that story, right? So you're here today for a really, really special thing, right?
Yes.
What are you here to do?
So we are going to be collaborating on a series of events through the month of July. And this is something that we started last summer, but that we're picking up again. And we're going to be doing a community reading of Frederick Douglass's speech, What to the Slave is the 4th of July.
That's awesome. I got to go last year, and it was really powerful. I brought some young people, and I think it even reinforced the importance of Lowell's history for them as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
And Bob put the bug in my ear last spring, and then we were able to pull it off with St. Anne's. That's who's actually hosting the reading. So we'll be there on July 3rd this year, which is a Wednesday. And it's so fantastic to hear those words in such a historic space.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, we talked about the history of St. Anne's and how significant that is for Lowell, but to have that story be told right in Lowell. And I think it's, like, for me, it's a really personal thing too, right? Because we always talk about 4th of July and, you know, oh yeah, patriot, you know, but being a person of color, sometimes you feel like, oh, maybe, again, what does the 4th of July mean to those folks, people of color, immigrants, all of those folks that have been probably negatively impacted by freedom, right?
Yeah, and I think that having it at St. Anne's reinforces the fact that that church back in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s was a stop on the Underground Railroad, and that Theodore Edson, the longtime minister of the church, was one of the leaders in Lowell of the Lowell Anti-Slavery Society, and that it helps, I think, locate that history in Lowell, because a lot of times we look at the mills and we forget the connection between the mills and cotton and where cotton came from. And so I'm intrigued by the fact, again, as a historian, of uncovering the layers of how much anti-slavery activity there is in this really wrenching contradiction in the middle of the 19th century. And so returning in a way to reading this in such a place is actually inspiring, but again, it also at the same time reinforces the value and the importance of the history, and being able through the park and through the church and other venues to get this out so people become more aware.
Yeah, for sure. And I don't think that folks even, I feel like we talk about it so often that folks just don't even realize that history in Lowell. Like, we know about the industry, we know a little bit about the abolitionist movement, but folks don't even realize that church was a stop on the Underground Railroad, which is so cool to me.
They were such a generous partner when we approached them about doing this and then doing it again. And we had some great conversations about why it needed to be there. And that we have auditoriums, we have great spaces in the downtown, and when you actually hear those words echoing off the same beams, the same seats, seeing the same stained glass, there's the acoustic quality, right? That this is a similar experience to what people had a long time ago. But, you know, Bob was there last year and we talked about this is the place where people found sanctuary. It was holy to them in all these different ways. So I think that is so powerful to feel today, and you can't recreate that any other way.
No, for sure.
And the fact too is that Edson was key in integrating churches in Lowell during the time before the Civil War. A lot of churches, even ones that were at least nominally anti-slavery, were segregated, and he basically welcomed anybody who wanted to come and worship in the church. And so that church was famous for being one of the first integrated churches in the country. And Lowell High, which was in the same neighborhood where the church is, slightly different building than what's there now, obviously, but it was one of the first integrated high schools in the country. And so there's, again, people miss that history sometimes, and just again how this sort of clash of worldviews is taking place within just blocks of each other, sitting there in the middle of the city.
Yeah, that's so amazing.
You have
I love the
integrated church,
dichotomy of it.
integrated high school. You had fugitives and people who were also free blacks who were living elsewhere in the area actually move to Lowell because they knew their kids could go to an integrated high school.
Yeah.
So it's pretty important for people to hear that.
That is so incredible. And all I could think while you said that about Edison is maybe he was a person who actually practiced what he preached, right?
Yeah.
Because we talk about, like, especially Lowell, right, being such a welcoming place and the diversity here, but it still sometimes can seem like there's just pockets of places and a little bit segregated depending on where you go or even what faith you practice, right? But the fact that that was like an integrated church and we're having this powerful speech being delivered, it really, and you do get chills when you're there, I feel like. I was listening to the words and I may have cried a little bit.
I think you could have heard a pin drop. And, you know, there's all different kinds of awesome programs that happen in Lowell. And the thing I've noticed, I haven't been here very long, is people are so willing to take a risk and willing to go with you and do something really interesting and stimulating. And the entire time, you know, I'm super nervous because we're getting all our readers queued up, and you really could hear a pin drop. I mean, people were so focused, so intent. And I think the words really meant different things to people. You know, I had 10 people come up to me in the days after, 10 totally different meanings from that one experience.
Wow.
A lot of people were thinking about how it resonated with a refugee experience or about Lowell specifically, but we all hear this speech given for a very specific purpose a long time ago, and we get these different meanings out of it, which is why we do it.
Yeah.
And not just read it at home on our computer, which you can do, but
Right, it just doesn't have the same
it doesn't.
effect. It doesn't. So what else is happening? Because there's a series of events, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So next Tuesday, so this will be Tuesday, June 11th, at our visitor center, we are actually having a speaker come up from the Washington Longfellow headquarters, which may not sound like an easy connection, but it is a park ranger named Garrett, and he's going to come and talk to us about Fanny Appleton. So a lot of Lowellians know the Appleton family as financiers in the city. Fanny Appleton was pretty wealthy and became a big-time speaker about abolition, or she was a passionate abolitionist. And one of the goals of that talk is going to introduce how do these wealthy Bostonians who make so much money from slavery also see themselves as abolitionists. And then comparing that with the way mill girls, who are from a very different class, also talk about abolition and talk about slavery. So that'll be kind of a primer from a Boston perspective. So just like 200 years ago, someone from Boston will come up here and tell us what they think, and then we'll keep the series going from there.
That's awesome. Wow, that's honestly, that's a perspective I hadn't really considered, like the financiers who are, well, no, we talked a little bit about how like mill owners and things like that, they'll be like, yeah, you can circulate your petitions, but, you know, just realize that we're also not going to pay you more. That's as long as you're cool with that. But I think I just find it so interesting that relationship, that connection. And like you said, the dichotomy or the difference between that connection and the mill girl's perspective.
Absolutely.
And some of the wealth the wealthy folks that invest in the city, it's like a generational struggle in the families where it's maybe the grandfather who in the early or mid 18th century was involved in the triangular trade and shipping and also filling, you know, ships with enslaved people and bringing them to Cuba and getting sugar or whatever, or rum, whatever it would be. And by the next generation, there's some wonder about, well, what are we doing? And by that third generation of young people, you start to have, you know, I like to imagine that there would be these clashes at the dinner table, like between me and my father about the Vietnam War, you know, in the sense of this sort of general, well, what are you, Dad, what are you doing? Like, what was your position on slavery? Like, where did you stand with respect to abolitionism? And so you do see, as we come closer, and then it really becomes obvious because several of the people that bankrolled John Brown, when John Brown raids Harper's Ferry, are bankrolled by the descendants of some of the people, very people who made all this money institutionalizing the trade in people in the 18th and early 19th century.
Wow.
It's
Yep.
so hard when you look back at the 1790s. So Slater Mill in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, part of the financial investment for that came from a person who was part of the Brown family of slave traders. They had made money through that system. It was the brother who was trying to get out of the slave trade who invested in Slater Mill. And we look back over 200 and almost 30 years later, and it seems so obvious that this is actually going to entrench that more because of the cotton industry and the way that that works. But he doesn't know that.
Right.
And I think it's a good example of someone who thinks they are making a step in a new direction, that because of another invention, the cotton gin, will actually just make this a lot worse. So it's kind of those unintended consequence moments. And that family in particular does a lot of grappling with what to do with their money, hence Brown University and lots of other things. But that's a conversation that's still ongoing today.
Wow.
And that's a nice segue to
It
Traces
is
of
a,
the Trade.
it
There
is
you
a
go.
nice segue. It's like we planned it. We didn't, but so after the Douglas talk on July 9th, we'll all be getting together again at the Visitor Center on Market Street and showing Traces of the Trade. I don't know if you want to talk a bit about that.
So Traces of the Trade is a documentary that was ultimately made by descendants of the Brown family and others in the DeWitts and this whole collection of people in Rhode Island who made all this money. And then at some point in their family history, as they were doing genealogy and sort of rethinking like where they came from, all of a sudden, because it was somewhat unspoken, they discovered that their extended family were, if not the largest, one of the largest families involved in the slave trade in America. And they sort of grappled within their family about what to do or not do. And then amongst several of them, and they're fairly wealthy, so they had the resources, they traced literally the title, Traces of the Trade. They went back to West Africa and figured out where their family had extracted people from and sort of did filming and sort of did like a mea culpa for their family in a way, but also then produced this really powerful documentary called Traces of the Trade, which really looks at like a family. And there was dissent in the family. Some people wanted to do it, some people didn't want to do the documentary. People were worried that it would expose their family to to harsh criticism for the legacy of where their money came from and all the rest. But then other people thought, it's interesting, right? Because in the family, some descendants are, are ministers and whatever. Most of them are really highly educated people. And they had never really thought about this until all of a sudden they kind of stumbled on this sort of like buried family history. So I find it a really brilliant film for provoking discussion.
Oh, I can't wait to watch that. To have that kind of like responsibility on your shoulders as a person and to actually do something with it, I just think that that's pretty great. That's incredible because you don't really see that in today's world, right? Where people who are wealthy are like, okay, let me figure out where this wealth came from and let me at least make up something for it.
Absolutely.
And to, I think, we always talk about history and knowing where you came from. It's important. And there's going to be some kind of clash when you find out the truth of where you came from and what do you do with that truth then. So that's pretty incredible. I can't wait for this documentary.
Absolutely. And then we have another conversation.
Yeah.
We keep you all very busy. So on Sunday, July 14th, we'll be getting together, and I'm really excited about this. So we've all talked about, there's sort of a popularity in some ways to programs about the Underground Railroad. It's something that interests people. It's something that people always want to know about. But we wanted to push our timeline forward. And so last month, we talked a bit about the Hale Howard community in Lowell and what happened there. And then this July, you and I are going to be talking about basically 20th century Black history and 21st century Black history, also with your colleague Masada. So
yeah, I'm really excited about that. We'll be talking more about like the impacts really of urban renewal kind of, and then what happened to those dispersed families and where they can make those links. I'm really excited to just kind of delve into that and make it more of an interactive experience, and hopefully folks show up from that era because I know people who were there during Hale Howard. They remember they were kids, they remember it being torn down, they remember moving into the South Common projects, their families being promised, oh yeah, once these houses get built in Belvedere, you'll have access to them. And then being told, oh, well, you know, something happened with the pipes, or, oh, we're going to have to push back the state, or whatever the case was. And then they never got that house on the hill and things like that. So I'm really excited to talk about that kind of history in Lowell, and the more recent accolades of folks, you know, who have been here. People like Masato, who born and raised here, who are doing amazing things, and then, you know, newcomers like maybe Krista Brown, who is making a huge impact in Lowell, you know, with her history, you know, related, well, not really related to history, but history formed Free Soil Arts Collective. So things like that and how it's kind of connected to our past. I'm really excited to talk about all of that. It's going to be great.
And even the title that she used of Free Soil, I
Yeah.
mean, that was an anti-slavery rallying cry. The original was Free Soil, Free Labor, Free Men, which
Exactly.
basically, I remember when I first saw it, I emailed her and said, you want to put free men and women. You know,
Or
we
just
were a little-
women, skip
we were a
the
little bit or just women,
Yeah.
right? We were a little bit misguided in the 19th century. But that link, again, is really fascinating, because in Lowell, in the 1850s, there is this movement of folks who identify themselves politically that way as well, in the midst of the Fugitive Slave Law. I mean, I was just I'm giving a talk tomorrow to a group of retirees. The university has this thing called LERA, Learning and Retirement Association, and I'm giving a talk about this history to them tomorrow morning. And I was just doing more reading and more research, and sort of came across, which I kind of knew but didn't, and then it really struck me over the head. One of the turning points leading up to the Civil War is passage of the Fugitive Slave Law. And so free soil, free labor is a rallying cry against the Fugitive Slave Law, amongst other things. And the Fugitive Slave Law is part of this series of compromises in history books called the Compromises of 1850. And I had forgotten, blocked it out or whatever, but one of the compromises is ending the slave trade in the District of Columbia in 1851. That's how long that's still going on. The rest of the country has outlawed the international slave trade in 1806, but it's still left to the states and the districts to decide whether there's going to be an internal trade in people. And the fact that the nation's capital, right, we need a law passed in 1850 as part of this compromise. So part of the compromise is, we'll stop selling people in the District of Columbia, but on the other hand, if any of those people who we've sold escape, it's now a federal law to turn them in. And I'm just sort of like, I was trying to wrap my brain around, how do you talk to people about, that's not that long ago in the scheme of history,
No.
Right.
and that it took that actual debate, people had to actually debate and argue whether to make that be a law or not. It's pretty profound.
Yeah.
Again, and I was also thinking of Frederick Douglass and what does the 4th of July mean and all of that, and thinking, okay, well, geez, like this history. And again, I'm somebody who teaches it, but that part of it I know it was in there, but last night I was sitting there getting ready for tomorrow, for Wednesday, and I thought, wow, this like slams me right in the head.
How do you decide on something like that? Like, humans, these are human body, like they're and I guess, me thinking, I always like, my niche is Black history, obviously, and how these laws affect us today. So thinking of things like the prison industrial complex, because I very much feel like the Fugitive Slave Law fed the beginnings of that in some capacity. And then I think about even how it relates to immigrants and refugees and the migrant farm workers and people like that who are still working those plantations down south, So I think about all of these things in terms of, and I guess I have to be careful, right, of not making the correlations, because they're not always 100% this is the reason, but when I see those patterns, it's just, wow, look at these puzzle pieces all coming together. So and we'll probably even talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely.
Oh man, so much to talk about.
Yeah, and again, I
Wow.
think that's the beauty of Lowell, because, again, as someone who teaches like 19th and 20th century U.S. history, I can just walk around, look around, just sort of look up or down, whatever, and there's somewhere in the city there's a story,
Always.
right? That can always be embedded inside what I'm doing to make it, because I think it makes it more real, right? If you
Yeah.
abstractly talk about, the Underground Railroad versus, they were out in what we think of as Pawtucketville now. There were farms out there where people would be hidden out. There was a whole neighborhood where fugitives lived. Up off Gorham Street. It's not there anymore, but that was a neighborhood. When Frederick Douglass frequently came to Lowell to speak at anti-slavery conventions or at rallies or whatever, he stayed in that neighborhood. William Lloyd Garrison, one of the leading abolitionists in the country, stayed in that neighborhood when he came, stayed in a house of John Levy, who was a free black who'd come from the islands in the Caribbean to live in Lowell. So there's the intersections are really quite profound, and I think the park gives people the space and the opportunity to be able to link those sorts of histories and say,
for sure.
I mean, even somebody like Kirk Boot, right, who we have the boot mill named after. Boot, so Linus Child, who's an overseer in one of the mills in the city, and Kirk Boot, who's an overseer in another one, live side by side in this row house where the park headquarters is today. That was built for overseers of these mills, and Boot is opposed to the anti-slavery movement, and Child and Edson are friends and plot together, even though Child is one of the people who operates these mills. He's also anti-slavery.
Wow.
And so again, it's like I walk by and look at that house on Kirk Street and think, okay, how weird is this? And this is the headquarters of the park.
And what were those conversations like? What were those little talks, right?
It's so sobering because you hear people say, social media is the reason why people have toxic conversations. And I can imagine there were words that were unkind and hard to hear exchanged on the street. It didn't happen from the privacy of your home, but people did write nasty letters about each other. And, to think that we have a particularly toxic moment that we're living in because of the internet, I think is a very limited view of the past. People were fighting and dueling in the streets, and it wasn't pleasant.
You just have to go see Hamilton.
Right, exactly. So
I was thinking even Shakespeare came up with some of the best insults.
Right,
like,
of course,
yeah.
of course. And, Douglass was not welcomed warmly everywhere he went.
Of course, I wouldn't imagine so, right?
So, I mean, we'll talk about this at the event, but he comes in the 1890s, and it's a rough speech that he gives. It's very critical of Lowell, and it's not something you hear a lot about because it's not the famous sort of Douglass photo opportunity that he was also famous for. So it's a different thing than we're used to, him calling to task people in the city.
Wow, and what a challenging position to be in as a black person at that time, talking about abolition in spaces that you're not always welcomed in, and in spaces like Lowell, where I feel like we have the people who are like, yeah, freedom, and then we have the people who are like, no, stop that. And like some of the articles that you've shared with us, and I think about those headlines and how inflammatory they were at that time. And to be that person to come here and say, no, but I'm going to still call you out on your stuff. Like, this is not okay. What you're doing is not all right, and this is what needs to be done. Who do you think you are, basically, right? And so that's a whole level of bravery and courage that I would love to embody someday.
We'll have to sing songs like they did, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, there's a whole world in, we would not sing this song, but, the Yankee mill girls would sing songs about not being slaves. That they're daughters of the Republic and that they are not slaves. And part of what they were doing was setting themselves up against enslaved people to say they deserved better treatment. That same person might be an abolitionist, but they don't believe in equality. They don't believe in equity. It's like, that's a whole other layer to this that's harder to get at. But when people ask, were they interested in abolition? Some were. Some also didn't think that had anything to do with equality or living in the same neighborhood as someone. And we see that in some ways to the present. So.
Oh yeah, for sure. Like,
I was going to say the 60s, but
I know it follows us everywhere, right? Well, I'm okay with those people as long as they're just not near me, whatever differing group it is.
And the giveaway is when you say those.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
You've already started to, well, I'm not. When you start a sentence that way, then you're sort of like, yeah, well, maybe you go
Let's
to.
unpack that.
Didn't start with Reddit.
Yeah. Oh,
Didn't start
gosh.
online.
Yeah.
But I think, I mean, the other thing is that the same way in the sort of time we're living in, people can have a variety of different perspectives on immigrants and refugees and sort of should people be granted citizenship, all these sort of debates that we have. Well, in the time of abolitionism, lots of people call themselves abolitionists, but they ran the gamut in terms of their position. So it's incredibly complex. I mean, one of the larger organizations was called the American Colonization Society. And basically what they wanted to do is essentially free and then round up all Africans and put them on ships and return them. And so some of the leading lights in American politics favored that. So James Monroe, who was the president, that's his position. And Monrovia is the name of the capital in Liberia, and that was going to be the place where the American Colonization Society would send people. So they're
There
at
you
one
go.
end of the spectrum, and people like Garrison and Douglas are at the other one, where they just simply say immediate, total end.
Yeah.
No compensation. Then other people want to say, well, we will create a fund and we will pay plantation owners money because they have made this investment in their property. And so we need to compensate them, and so the federal government needs to tax people to create a fund that will then pay, right? So there are all of this stuff, and so Garrison is considered is actually probably one of the most vilified people in the Republic before the Civil War, because he basically says the Constitution's in league with the devil, and essentially and he's also anti-politics. He says we shouldn't be debating and voting on this. We should just end it. This is not a question that should be voted on. People should be free. We should not do a referendum to decide whether we think people should be free or not. People should be free,
my
period.
goodness. Yes.
Right? And so
It's just free people.
yeah, but free soil, free labor, whatever, right? I mean,
Yes.
all of that stuff is just so yeah, it doesn't take the World Wide Web to to create. I mean, people try kidnapping and killing Garrison more than once
Golly.
when he travels, and his newspapers are banned in the South.
Right.
Jeez. There's so many more ways that we could go with this conversation, but I want to give Allison a chance to tell us
Sure.
something else that's coming up before we have to wrap.
Sure. So the program that we'll be doing together
Yes.
on July 14th is called Lowell Talks, and these are community conversations. We've done one with Bob that had great turnout, really interesting questions. And this Sunday on June 9th, we'll be talking about climate change and what that has to do with the labor movement. So we've invited someone from the Network for Labor Sustainability, and so we're really excited about talk about what do jobs and climate change have to do with each other. So directly related to our story. That's at 2 at the Boot Cotton Mills Museum.
Excellent. And there's so many exciting things happening this summer. I hope folks come, and we're going to really dig into our history and make people feel uncomfortable, I hope.
Yes.
Because, the only way you grow and learn is to be uncomfortable.
Yep.
So that's what we're going to do.
If you're twitching, you're learning.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sweat a little bit.
Yes.
Well, thank you, Allison.
Thank you for
coming on
having
the
me.
show.
Thank you.
Yes, and thank you, Bob, always for getting
Always
my
a pleasure.
fire going.
Always a pleasure.
And thank you, viewers, for tuning in. Hope you learned something today, and I hope you attend the Lowell Talks. This is History in Lowell.